to the 6th edition of Himalayan Echoes. My name is Mandakini Kaul, and I work with the World Bank on regional cooperation in South Asia. With COP26, climate change has very much been in the news this past month, and leaders of all South Asian countries have made several pledges and pronouncements. However, it is apparent that no single country can deal with a climate crisis of this scale on its own. Our session today will focus on climate change in South Asia and regional collaborative solutions. In particular, we will look at the three mountain and also by setting the context and urgency for our conversation. Countries in South Asia share the Himalayan, Karakoram, and Hindu Kush mountain ranges and associated river basins where 1.9 billion people live. 5 out of 8 countries share coastlines. According to the World Bank Group's recently released South Asia Climate Roadmap, it is one of the world's most vulnerable regions to climate shocks. Its people are living through a new climate normal where intensifying heat waves, cyclones, droughts, and floods are testing the limits of governments, businesses, and citizens to adapt. What does this mean, and why is it important for you and me? Well, did you know Jacobabad in Pakistan's Sindh province was the hottest city on the planet this year? Or that last year more than 3 million people were evacuated from the fury of super cyclone Amphan? We have all experienced the fallout of climate change, be it summers that are hotter, winters that are colder, or vice versa, monsoons that come earlier or are delayed. All of these have an associated cost. Let me share 3 data facts to illustrate this. First, more than half of all South Asians, or that is 750 million people, have been affected by one or more climate-related disasters in the last 20 years. Second, it is estimated that floods alone could cost the region over $200 billion annually in the next 10 years by the year 2030. And third, by the end of this century, projected losses from climate change, if nothing is done about it, in national incomes could be as high as 18% for Bhutan, 13% for Nepal, and 10% for India. To deal with this crisis, South Asian countries are moving towards a growth and development model that is green, resilient, and inclusive. For instance, Bhutan is the world's first carbon negative country with 60% land under forest cover. Nepal's community-based forest management led to a 40% reduction in deforestation. And India, the world's third largest emitter, now has the 5th largest installed solar power capacity. Looking ahead, the question is, how can South Asian countries work collaboratively to put the region on a more equitable, prosperous, and cleaner path? To continue this conversation, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Anjal Prakash, who is Research Director and Adjunct Associate Professor at the Bharati Institute of Public Policy, Indian School of Business in Hyderabad. Anjal has over 2 decades of experience in working on water and climate issues, focusing on policy research, advocacy, capacity building, and knowledge. And he has written and edited several publications. Anjal, it is a pleasure to be in conversation with you today. Let me begin with asking you my first question.
Go ahead. Thank you so much, Mandakini.
So, Anjal, climate risks do not respect national borders, as we know, and issues such as weather forecasting, air pollution reduction, water resource management are transboundary. So my question is, how can South Asian countries come together for urgent and collaborative solutions that will help put the region on a more sustainable development path?
Thank you so much, Mandakini. It's a very pertinent question that you've asked, and let me just put this into a slightly in the context of the recent IPCC reports that have been confirming the similar trends that you have outlined. So I was part of the special report on oceans and cryosphere. This was published in 2019. We have gathered about 200 global scientists from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I was one of them. And we looked at the status of two interconnected systems, the mountain system, the cryosphere, and the oceans. And we will try to see how what is happening to these very climate change hotspot regions such as Himalayas, apart from the other global regions. And what we found is that one of the key findings of the assessment showed that the recent warming trends directly reduce the snow cover, the melting glaciers, and degrade the permafrost. In the future, if the warming is kept to about 1.5 degrees centigrade in the Himalayan region, this will be likely to go 0.3 to 0.7% degree higher. The latest report, which is published now in 2021, also reaffirms this kind of finding that we already know. So climate change is out there, and then the way it is impacting our lives, you've seen what is happening, like for recent flood in Uttarakhand, for example. We know from other regions of Hindu Kush Himalayan region, that is creating havoc in the lives of the people, especially the poor people, because they don't have any other means to survive. So we do not have any other go other than cooperation between countries, because the change process doesn't follow any political boundary. I've been part of EC mode, have worked there for a long time, and we know that it is one of the most difficult region, especially in terms of the regional cooperation. And you yourself have been working. It's very hard, but it is the need of the hour. So much so that we desired regional cooperation, especially in terms of data sharing. Now, I'll outline one or 2 points before I go over to you. One is in terms of the upstream, downstream linkages. See, rivers are originating sometime in China. Most of the rivers in India, for example, be it Ganges, Brahmaputra, or Indus River, they all originate upstream, and then they flow through several countries to go downstream. We need to have the cooperation because the climate change is changing the water regimes. The way precipitation is happening is totally changed. The seasons are changing. So we need to have much, much greater cooperation than we had ever before. And that is the need of the hour.
Thank you, Anjal. I think that was a very important point that, and EC mode is an institution that I've had the opportunity to interact with as well. That, as you say, perhaps the start can be made by simply sharing data, and that can lead to water flows. Those could be the beginning, and then that could lead to other areas of cooperation. So very important point. Let me move on to my next question, which is also related in a sense to the development agenda. Now, as we know, South Asia has an unfinished development agenda and legitimate expectations of growing to middle income status. How can this growth be green and inclusive? How can very important issues of climate justice, gender justice, and equity be addressed in this context? I know you have a particular interest in this, that you're part of the task force, the IPCC task force on gender. So we would very much appreciate hearing your views on this.
Yeah, thanks so much. We've been looking at two things, two concepts here. First is about the issue of climate justice and how gender justice is ingrained into the whole concept of climate justice. Now, very quickly, for the larger understanding, climate justice is an idea that climate changes have been caused by deeply political and unethical developmental models. Like the two sectors which has been hardest hit by climate change is water and agriculture. Now, both these sectors where women workforce participation is also very high. And especially in South Asia and in the hill region, if you find, women are actually at the forefront of the economy. Women also have, from the global south, have been at the receiving end of decisions about the climate without being given any seat on the table, without having contributed much to the global warming in the first place. So women's representation is very, very skewed in the entire gamut of leadership. You see the COP26, for example, if you do a gender analysis, you'll find very few women actually representing. Though as a large group of people, they are the hardest hit. So any climate justice agenda must take gender justice into account. Now, I'll just outline 2 or 3 points where this can start. One is definitely that more and more women have to come in the forefront of decision-making process, especially wherever the major decisions are happening, be it at national level or sub-national level or regional level. That is one. Representation part is very, very important, and we need to have really progressive policies where we can break them. Second is the sectors which are hardest hit, as I said, for example, agriculture. Now, most of the time, what we have seen that there's a male migration which has happened from the hills to the plains, and women are left with most of the economic affairs which is happening at the village level. They are totally responsible. So it's like a double whammy for them, because they have to really take care of the entire gamut of the things. And on the top, the climate change is bringing a lot of climate risk. So how do they induct into local level planning? How do they contribute and also get benefited? That's the whole part of it. So what I'm saying is that climate justice, that the framework that we are looking at it may address the climate change from an intersectional perspective and through a knowledge system, which actually acknowledge the climate change, that that climate change not only exacerbate the gender gap, it's also in the process of combating climate change. How do we bring in solutions which are gender just? And it should not also increase the burdening of women. And that is the whole process, that we use this transformation agenda for gender just process as well. And that's something is important for us to think, especially from the policymakers perspective, and also from local, implementing in the local process, or at least in the local level where climate change is, because climate change is very localized phenomenon. The impacts are very localized, in say 100 kilometers or 200 kilometers. If there's a huge rainfall happens, it may be dry the other side, that kind of stuff. So then we have to really get them on board, and especially women folk on board.
Thank you, Anjal. So again, as you're saying, when you think of policies, think of ways in which men and women can be equally benefited. Sort of have these gender-based policies, especially I think for areas which often tend to be gender-blind. So I think agriculture, you said, is disproportionately impacted by climate change, but also especially in the hills regions, disproportionately worked upon by women. So how we give them voice. So very good suggestions on that. Thank you. Let me move on to my third question, and we are switching gears a little bit, Anjal. In a recent blog, I was going through some of the written work you've done, very interesting. So in a recent blog, you wrote that climate change is bringing challenges, but it is also an opportunity for businesses to expand and diversify to newer areas, which could prove profitable while also helping mitigate the impact of climate change. So how can the private sector be a part of the solution? And how can they help governments in this, what I would really call is a war or a battle? Would love to hear.
Yeah. So, I mean, that is another way of looking at it, that climate change is not only bringing challenges, but it's also bringing opportunities, and how in the long run businesses can be a a process in which they can help combating climate change. And I'll point out about 3 points here, just to take this conversation forward. So first is that there has to be an acknowledgement of the problem. I think many time what we've seen, that there has been a climate denial, people who think that the climate change doesn't exist, and that thing is, I think that those people are in a minuscule minority, but the businesses have to be, have to induct, because they are at the loss. If there is any, say, for example, any climate catastrophe happens, or any risk which is there, a city, for example, is, under flood for 5 days or 6 days. Imagine any of the metro cities, what impact it has. So first is to acknowledge the climate change, that the climate change exists, and understand how it impacts their own businesses. The risk could involve direct or indirect climate change event, and it may disrupt the value chain or demand network, leading to a loss of profit and the damage in the infrastructure or the markets. They have to first acknowledge. Now, second is that one has to change the business strategy to adjust to the new normal. And that means we have to handle that, what we call the triple bottom line, the 3 Ps, the profit, people, and the planet. How do we look at it in the balance? And this could be done by developing a process through which they could manage their financial, social, economic, and the environmental risk based on the commitment and the prospect that have. So that is the second point. The third is, as we said, that they need to be part of the solution, not the problems. You know that most of the industries also there could be, impacts of industries on environment, but how do they bring in? For example, now we in India, the Indian Prime Minister has announced India to be net zero by 2070. Now look at it from each business's perspective. For example, how do we change that process in internally so that we are net zero in our own understanding? So this challenge, it's also an opportunity for business to expand and diversify to the newer areas which could prove profitable, while also helping mitigate the impact of climate change. Now, some of the sectors where companies could invest are the renewable energy, agriculture, forest produce, sustainable linked financing, climate services, insurance. These are newer areas which is giving them avenues. So they should be part of the solution than being part of the problem.
Thank you, Anjal. I think you were very, I like profit, people, and planet. I think the three Ps are very important. But also, like you said, there are new sectors that are emerging, areas where businesses can acknowledge and also take part. Renewables, of course, renewable energy is a big area where we've already seen there's been a lot of work that's been done by the private sector with the government and external agencies. So very important. I know we are running out of time, so let me move on to my next question, which is something that I'm particularly interested in. So I would like to get your views. And this is about the so-called dilemma facing the region. We've already discussed South Asia's unique climate context, the uncertain monsoon patterns, the melting Himalayan glaciers, the vulnerable low-lying coastal cities, all of which point to the urgency of adaptation. At the same time, delaying climate action and postponing mitigation efforts can only increase costs. So how should the countries of South Asia navigate between this long-term global focus on mitigation and the short-term domestic requirements for adaptation, especially in the context of, I think, what is very limited funding?
Okay. I think there was a disruption. Can we just, now we can hear you. Can you hear me now? Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I look at it from two perspectives. One is definitely about the adaptation being a short-term goal for us to immediately respond to certain change in the climate system. Mitigation is a long-term goal, because if you do not fix the problems of environment, it will reoccur, and then things will come as a compound and disbenefit for you. So that there's this kind of thing. But at some point, we also see that some of the adaptation efforts could also be mitigating. And I'll give you one example of forest restoration. Now, for India, for example, Prime Minister Modi has announced that by 2030, we will actually be not cutting any more trees. And that's something which is a welcome effort. I'm sure in the similar region, especially in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, if we really take a pledge that we will not get into a deforestation process, for example, we will and restore the forests which is already existing. And definitely when you start restoring the forest itself, regenerate. What it does that it definitely fixes the carbon, because it's a carbon sink. So it gives you net zero much faster rate than you have ever done before. Second is also because of this minor forest produce that it gives you, women and men, and especially people who are directly dependent on the forest resources, they will get benefited by this whole process. So I see that mitigation and adaptation process could go hand in hand. In fact, they should start from the day one itself. Second is about the adaptation planning, where I think what we call the district level planning is required. Now, if you see the weather patterns, especially in the Himalayan region, has shifted. My own field work, I've done last 3-4 years, very extensive anthropological work in the Himalayan region. And I found that we have the weather has shifted about 15 to 20 days. So if you were sowing rice, for example, now 15 years before, it will be 15 days after that. And that shift in weather pattern has brought in a lot of changes in terms of the access to certain resources, because when you want rain, rain will not come, and when you don't want, suddenly it will be a downpour. So it disrupts the entire agriculture system. So adaptation planning, and also it's very localized process, as I said. So we need to have that district level adaptation planning, the large scale climate information that we have, which is a very global level, and especially at the regional level, it has to be scaled down to the district level. And that is where the most of the action has to be culminating. Now, last point here is also about climate finance. See, most of the region in the countries in the Hindu Kush Himalayan regions are developing countries. You look at Nepal, Bhutan, Pakistan, India, Myanmar. All of us are having a similar development trajectory. Now, if we have to divert our economic resources to combat climate change, it is at the cost of the development. And that is where we need to have the global responsibility. So accountability for us, if the developed country wants us to be net zero by a certain time, they should also be accountable to give us the pledge that they have for 100 crores, for example. 100 billion US dollar per year is what the industrialized nation has pledged it, but that money has not come. So the accountability I see is a two-way process. That money should start flowing as in terms of climate finance. We need to then take this forward in terms of how do we put that money into the development planning, especially the district level development planning, for a gender just, climate just development process. And that is what I see a vision for South Asia. Over to you.
Thank you, Anjal. I think that's a very important point about accountability and responsibility. So, it's a two-way process. And as you said, adaptation and mitigation, which perhaps to the layman may appear to be different ends of the spectrum, are actually could move together. My final question, because you've mentioned district level planning a couple of times, is so I would like to ask you a very quick question about institutions in South Asia, in these countries. Are they robust? Are there any changes that are required to actually deal with climate change? We have in South Asia, we have large federal countries like India, Pakistan. Then we are dealing with small landlocked countries of Bhutan, Nepal. So perhaps you could focus on some versus the other. But what are the kinds of institutions we need to deal with this climate change?
Yeah, we need to actually have a special vehicle, purpose vehicle for climate change drivers in the entire region, I would say. And that means if you look at the supranational level, regional organization like ECMOD kind of organization, which needs to be much more strengthened in terms of the countries coming together. We already have been doing it, but I think there's a lot more focus is required for managing in terms of the data that we have, in terms of what is the way, because it's a scientific institution which will give you a lot of stronghold in terms of what are the national policies that you should drive home, looking at the global changes and its impact on the region. That's one. Second is that each country, that means will have to then absorb this and then take this forward. And I'll give you an example from India. Now, one of the institutional change which I have been very vocal about is to have a separate ministry for climate change. You look at the catastrophe that we are having, India has all the regions, ecological regions of the world, and especially the hotspot regions which climate change is going to be impacting. We have all of them actually in the large number. And that means that we are not spared if any of the systems get dismantled because of climate change or any shift that happens, be it a Himalayan region, be it a coastal region, or a large semi-arid region that we have. About 54% of India is semi-arid region. And that means we will be impacted from all ends. Now, just to give an example of, at this moment, institutionally, climate change is part of Ministry of Environment and Forest. It actually says Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. It's actually a backyard ministry with a desk with some people there. I do not see that the focus that we have now, especially by Prime Minister Modi announcing that the net zero, target that India has, you need to have a separate ministry for climate change, because climate change is much more than environment and forest. It is much more, all the more about coordination between different sectors. So my best foot forward is the similar kind of institutional changes has to happen at different levels.
Thank you, Anjal. We are at the end of our session. So I ask if there's one final thought that you would like to leave us with as we wrap up our session.
I would, start with end with where we started. I would like to see a much more regional cooperation, as you said, Mandakini, in the first place. I think we have to cooperate. We just cannot, we don't have any other means because the problem is too huge and the region is too large for us to keep, our conflict at bay. We need to come together and fight this together.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent way to end. South Asia, especially post-pandemic, does have an opportunity to transition its agriculture, energy, urban systems through climate-smart investments. And if the region can come together to build resilience, reduce emissions, and boost economic growth, I think that will be to the benefit of all of its people. So thank you very much, Anjal.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Saga